When it comes to depictions of depression in the media, there are many reasons why it can go wrong. Whether it can be from a portrayal that isn't genuine to those actually suffering from depression, or a portrayal that glorifies the suffering without actually acknowledging the issues, good portrayals of depression are rare. Depression is something I have a lot of interest in. So when I found Danish filmmaker Lars von Trier's Depression Trilogy, they were a must-watch for me. Known for dealing with difficult social problems and controversial subject matters in his films, Lars von Trier deals with raw and unfiltered human emotion and experiences, making him the perfect filmmaker for this topic. Born in Denmark in 1956 to dedicated nudists, Lars grew up in a home he described as not allowing much room for feelings, religion, or enjoyment. Suffering from depression himself, it's clear that Lars von Trier put a lot of himself and his own experiences with depression in these films, and today I'm going to talk about each of them one by one. In Antichrist, we follow an unnamed man and woman grieving the accidental death of their toddler child. The woman develops depression and an intense fear of the woods, so the man suggests taking a trip to Eden, a nearby forest for exposure and psychological therapy. From there, we watch as a seemingly straightforward story spirals into a horrifying detour full of talking animals, witchcraft, and mutilation that leads to an unforgettable ending. It should be said that not only is this Lars von Trier's trilogy, but also Charlotte Gainsbourg, as she plays one of the leads in all three of these movies, and usually the one with depression. In this movie, she's joined by Willem Dafoe, who both give powerful performances in this role that required both of these actors to be in pain lots of the time. I'm gonna be honest, I should definitely watch Antichrist a couple more times because a lot of this stuff might click better on a second viewing, but from what I remember, this was a very visually inventive movie. The film is slower paced, but the movie is just beautifully framed, and they also utilize this ultra slow motion camera that allows them to get some really great shots. One thing I notice in this trilogy is that in every installment, the root cause of the horror or the depression by extent is caused by a different influence on your mental health. In Antichrist, I'd say the horror is meant to be the natural influences on depression, most obviously being the death of a child contributing to heavy feelings of grief that lead to a violent outburst at the end of the film. Furthermore, the horror of self-disemboweling animals, swollen ticks, and stillborn deer seem to further depict nature itself attacking the couple staying in the woods. The feeling that the world itself is against you is a sentiment that can sadly be shared among those suffering from depression, and its literal depiction here is raw, confusing, and visceral. Antichrist is a deeply uncomfortable and challenging film to watch, but one that examines one aspect of depression in a personal, unrestrained manner. 2 years later, Lars followed it up with Melancholia, a meditative, slower, and less visually aggressive movie overall. Starring Kirsten Dunst, Kiefer Sutherland, and again Charlotte Gainsbourg, Melancholia follows the recently wed Justine at her wedding party. Attending are her sister and her husband, the two hosts who try to keep the party in order. After several tedious and realistic depressive episodes throughout the night, Justine quits her job and calls off the marriage. What follows is the final moments of the human race, as a nearby planet known as Melancholia veers off course and crashes into the planet Earth. In those final moments, however, it's interesting to observe her sister freak out in the face of unavoidable disaster, whereas Justine remains completely calm. This isn't actually uncommon, as it's been researched before that people suffering from mental illness are more likely to calmly deal with stressful situations. Melancholia also seems to be his only film not to depict violent or taboo content on screen, while still managing to be one of the most emotionally draining for the viewer. With its slower paced and less dialogue-heavy approach to storytelling, Melancholia deserves its reputation as one of the best visual portrayals of depression ever. In this film, however, rather than the depression stemming from nature, it stems from the inevitable, and by extent, the existential. The planet Melancholia will wipe out all life on Earth. That is something that can't be avoided. The idea of death or finality is something that can really manifest itself as depression, and this film serves as a confrontation to those issues, as well as an examination of how different minds react to the inevitable. Then 2 years after that, Lars followed it up with his 5.5-hour film Nymphomaniac. Nymphomaniac follows a woman named Jo recounting her life story while she heals up from an assault in a stranger's bed. The entire story is presented to us in flashbacks, with the occasional interruption from the stranger, interjecting with his own thoughts and experiences, something that Lars von Trier would later perfect in The House That Jack Built. The story Jo tells us is, unsurprisingly, an extremely sexual story of her upbringing, her relations with sex, and the surprising way she perceives these events. Listening to the way events and things she has done are described, it becomes clear that Jo is a person who deals with a lot of self-hatred. Even in situations where she is clearly a victim, Jo sees herself as the one responsible and at fault in the situation. It's interesting though that despite the disturbing nature of her life story, Jo herself never seems to express any sort of regret or sorrow over her past, something that really helps the conversational aspect of the film. The conversation itself covers a lot of topics, but it circles back to the fact that her experiences were fundamentally shaped through the lens of being a woman, and they question whether as a man she would still be seen as a nymphomaniac. This is the film's subtle acknowledgement of the societal stigmas that have detrimental effects on the mental health of women. Jo has a lot of self-hatred and trauma in her life, and she blames her nymphomania. But the more you listen, you realize it's not really the sex that's causing her any issues, but mental illnesses added onto a really tragic life. And if it isn't clear, rather than focusing on natural or existential influences, this film deals with the personal and psychological influences on depression. While Jo herself says and does some morally questionable things to say the least, it's clear that she is a very tired person who has lived an unbelievably sad life. It's almost expected that someone dealing with this much grief must have some toll on their mental health, and while that is obvious to the viewer and the stranger, it isn't to her. Depression and mental illness is a very sensitive topic that needs to be treated with respect in its depiction, and as far as realistic depictions analyzing uncomfortable and at times disturbing aspects of depression goes, you cannot get much better than the Depression Trilogy. I can't even begin to fully express the way these three films moved me on such a personal level, and I genuinely cannot recommend these movies enough. They are disturbing because they are about disturbing topics that affect so much of us, and as humans, it's our responsibility to seek out and empathize with those suffering what so many can't even begin to imagine. I would love to revisit each of these films individually, but for now, I'll just leave it at this. I hope you took something out of this, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Peace.